Yeah, unfortunately, there's no real other insightful information to give in something like this. It really is just a matter of patience, filling in the dots, going nice and slow. And it's interesting. I think students really learn this and take faith in this when doing the barred plates. Because I get some barred plates where students have spent large numbers of hours with really sharp pencils, filling in and getting really nice, clean dots. But then for some reason, when we get to this point in the program, that level of finish that they learned in first term doesn't seem to coincide and fit in with the figure drawing here. I think part of it is because most students feel like they don't have time to take their figure drawing home and work on it. And so they don't do all this filling in the dots. I'm not sure if there's any other reason to it than that. But or just lack of comfort of doing this without the model, which could very well be. Yeah.
I think that has something to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
The living, breathing part of working with a model, and then so during the bar plates, there's this level of comfort because, I mean, you're all you're doing is staring at this very stagnant thing,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
for some reason in our brains, it working with a model, it just becomes a completely different thing. But if we can kind of marry those two experiences together,
Yeah.
I think you can find a balance for yourself.
Yeah, that's the thing for sure. We need to really seek the connections between
Mhm.
things, and I do notice that people who seek more positive connections in all this process tend to do a lot better, rather than the students we get who are a little more negative that try to point out every little thing that's different.
Or complaining about the same thing over and over
Right,
again.
right. You really have to have a particular type of attitude, I think, to propel yourself forward. Understanding that any excuse for your work not coming out right is not a valid excuse. There is just no excuse, because the whole point of this process, the whole point of our training, is to learn how to do all of this despite all of those things that are holding you back. Not have a reason for them not coming out the way we want them to. So if that comes down to taking this drawing home and filling in all the dots for hours in between poses, like I did here, so that you can work on that next level of finish with the model, then that's what we need to do. We can't just use the excuse that we don't have time. Because if that's the case, then why are we even doing this in the first place? If you're not going to put in enough time to make it the highest quality possible, then we might as well go do something else that doesn't require this time investment, rather than have a drawing that ultimately is not a success. Why even put ourselves in that position? And here we're in our program here, we've got a week in between sessions with the model. So that requires somebody to find 3 to 4 hours outside of class in a week to be able to fill all this in and advance the drawing further. If this were a more full-time program, this is something we could do with the model in class, under the teacher's guidance. But unfortunately, we have to pick up the slack and do some of it at home. And filling in the dots is something we can do at home, especially if we've done the barred plates where it's something that we've done. So I finished filling in all the dots. I'm working with the model now, actually. And so I'm trying to advance the leg a little bit further. You can see how smooth it looks and how close to being done it looks after just filling in the dots, which is where I want it to be. This was how I wanted the progression of the rest of that drawing to be and the rest of the torso to be. And so now I'm doing these tiny little value modulations where I'm stepping back each time I take my pencil back. And then I'm coming up and just lightly doing these marks. Now, remember, it doesn't look like I'm doing them lightly because it's so quickly, but I'm holding my pencil again at the very back, really light adjustments, stepping back and squinting to see how those transitions are looking. Then I'm trying to remove some of that chalk. Didn't remove enough, so I'm using the click eraser. So my stump is my first option for removing chalk. If that doesn't work, I have to go to more drastic measures, which is that eraser. But this lake will develop into a pretty nice finish pretty quickly here.
I think it might be a little overwhelming for people to, and it was for me when I first started the program, to think about the time involved.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of want to panic a little bit, and you don't know where this time is going to come from.
Yeah.
But really, I would just encourage people to create a schedule for themselves. Get a good old-fashioned date book, calendar,
Yeah.
and write in, block out like certain times that you're going to do certain things. So you're making a schedule for yourself that you can try to stick to. Keep in mind that first run of this new schedule might not work.
Right.
So you can try another one. And it's okay to reevaluate like what works for you. And maybe you want to be an early riser, but you're not. Well, maybe that means that you're going to do a lot of your work late in the evening, and that's fine too.
Yeah.
It's to get those hours in. That's important, and it's not going to happen overnight, but it's going to happen with consistency and with planning, and just being give yourself a little grace, but not too much.
Yeah. You have to find that balance, and when you're trying to do this on your own without a rigid full-time school schedule, it can be tough to carve out that time, especially if you have family demands, or friends, or traveling plans, or job, right? Yeah. I do tend to see that the students that struggle the most are the ones who are really traveling frequently and have a social life, which is prohibiting them from doing all of the work they need to be doing in here. And you just end up having to prioritize. And it does become easy also to fall into that mindset of, oh, well, that's just an exercise, so I can put it off, or I only need to do it once. I don't need to keep hitting it hard day after day after day. But this really is, it's all training. And, if you need be, get the basics down and then train every day on something that's interesting to you, be it landscape, still life, figure, portrait, whatever, provided you've conditioned yourself into those habits and abilities that we've talked about. But you have to find something that gets you back to the easel, preferably every single day. I know some folks who've tried to do just like 3 days out of the week, or something like that, where they've adjusted their work schedule so that they work a ton, and then 3 days out of the week they're free to do art. But then what ends up happening there is they're so tired that one day they can't, and then another day they have to do all the grocery shopping and do all that sort of stuff, and so then that leaves them 1 day out of the week to do art. That's not enough. You have to position yourself to where you can be doing this every day or almost every single day, even if it's only for a couple hours. Now, the nice thing about drawing is that that's easy for us. There's not a whole lot of cleanup time, setup time, or anything like that. You can just go up to the easel and work, especially if you're working from a still life or a photo reference. So there should be no excuse there. Like you said, whether it's early in the morning, whether it's late at night. I know when I was in Chicago working one of the jobs I had at the hospital, I got off at 11 p.m. And because I was engaged at the time, and I had family obligations during the day, and I had a job in the evening, I got home at 11 p.m., and so that's when I painted. And I painted from about 11:30 p.m. to about 3:30 in the morning, or 4 in the morning, and then I would sleep and then get up at 9 or 10, and then I would do all the other obligations that I had. Not to say that that's what everybody needs to do, but when I was younger, I had that no compromise kind of attitude. I wanted it all. I was going to have the job, I was going to do the family stuff, and I was going to do the art stuff. And as a result, the thing that I had to trade off was sleep, which I could do when I was younger. A lot of people sort of smile when I say that and say, oh, well, you were young, and yeah, it's true. But I made a deliberate decision to not sleep as much. That was my choice. And you have to carve that time out somewhere, and so it's up to you. It's your social life, your family time, your sleep, your job, whatever it is, you have to carve it out. We have 24 hours in a day, and so that's how I think of it. And a job takes 8 hours plus travel. That can be 9 or 10 hours a day. So that leaves you upwards of 14 hours. And it's hard for people to realize that 14 hours is kind of a long time. You know, we can do 8 hours for sleep. That gives us 6 hours left. We've got to eat in there. But we should be able to finagle a few hours each day on this. And we have to somewhere. And the trick is to getting your schedule set up to where you've blocked out that time and you're not going to compromise. And even if it's an assignment or drawing that seems like you can put it off, you just have to not. And eventually, it will become more habit forming, which is the great thing, because it's all part of that conditioning. You know, if you're spotty with your working, or you only do it a couple days a week, you're not going to be conditioned into the habit of working all the time. But if you've carved out a set of hours each day, then eventually it's going to get to the point where it's just time to start drawing, and that's what it's time for, and you just do it. And there's not a whole lot of struggle to make that time, as there will be in the beginning, but there will be in the beginning. Absolutely, everybody goes through that. I don't think there's anybody who doesn't go through that.
Yeah, I think that, especially in the beginning for me, it kind of felt like more of an event that I had to plan for.
Yes,
and it had
absolutely.
to be kind of this long, daunting, intense, whatever, because I didn't understand. I didn't understand the second nature part of it yet, and I didn't understand taking breaks while I was drawing. So
Right.
because that's taxing. I mean,
Yeah.
if you're committing 3 hours to work on your drawing or painting, and you're going an hour and a half before you take that first break, I mean, yeah, you're going to look back and think about, well, first of all, you're going to find all these problems after
Right,
an hour and a half,
absolutely,
and you're going to backtrack, and you're going to do all, it's just a nightmare. But not only that, but you're going to think about your time drawing as this, like,
Yeah.
this rough experience, and it doesn't have to be.
Right.
It can be efficient, and you have control over that. And I think the bottom line is that you can make the decision as to where this time is coming from, what you're gonna quote unquote sacrifice for that time.
Right.
And it's completely doable.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting too, because especially in this area and the kind of clientele that attends a lot of workshops and even some classes, we do get some students who are, through their various lives, are accustomed to being able to buy anything they want, just because of their position in life. And I think some students get into this mindset where if they've paid for a class and they've taken it, then they've acquired the skills, or they should be able to pay for something and acquire the skills and then be done with it and move on. And they don't realize that there's no amount of money that can buy this. It's a really interesting fact that, sure, we may have bought these videos to learn, but that certainly doesn't mean just because we spent a few $100s on this that we know all of this stuff.
Well, yeah.
And time is the most valuable commodity we have. And because this is something that you can't buy, so you have to, like you said, sacrifice.
Yeah, it's like
You have
going to
give
the
up something else.
gym to hang out.
Right, absolutely, yeah. Notice I'm starting to rely some on my knowledge of shadow anatomy here to help introduce a little bit more information in this leg. Because again, that leg is super, super subtle, and I need to make sure that the anatomy is expressed here. And this is something that a lot of students might miss, but I've got this very, very faint core shadow running along the thigh there, and now I'm crisping up the calf shadow that's being cast down onto the calf. And it's this subtlety that's going to really help coax out some of the form there. And it's not super, super present in the photo. And in fact, in the photo, it might be just as much, or if not more, indicated by color change, like the core shadow there. But with the drawing, I have to push it just a little bit so that it doesn't read as a notan from just light to dark. And that's what I see a lot too. If students can't readily identify the core shadow, then they don't indicate it, and that makes things tend to look flatter, like the light shape and dark shape are just kind of cut out and pasted next to each other. Now you can kind of see it when you zoom in on the reference photo at home. you should be able to see that core shadow running along the 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 thigh there where it's pinched against the calf. Now on the lower leg, it's a lot tougher to see that core shadow, but it's there just a little bit, and it has to be indicated. And if it's not indicated, then that lower leg is going to look really, really flat. And so we can kind of see it when we zoom in really close, but again, it's very, very faint, and something that we have to train ourselves to be able to see and indicate. I know one of the biggest responses that I get back from students when I tell them something like that, like, oh, you don't forget to add your core shadow. They say, well, I don't see a core shadow. That doesn't mean it's not there.
Mm-hmm.
We have to understand that, especially early on, we have not yet developed our eye to be sensitive enough to see these things. But in almost all situations, we're going to see something there, even if it's super, super subtle. And the key is to indicate it, but also indicate it with such subtlety that the viewer might glance at the drawing and not even realize that it's there. But that's kind of the level that we need to try and strive for here. And that's kind of what we look for in Vanderpool. And a lot of the Vanderpool drawings, and it also depends on which copy of the book you got, some of the anatomy is just barely there.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to, in some instances, even take out a magnifying glass to be able to see some of it if your eyes aren't super awesome. And it's to the point where we can't just ignore it because it's hard for us to see. I still want us to put it there, and we need to put it there to flush out this drawing and really make it jump off the page. But we can't blow it out of the water. So we're dancing this line between how much can we indicate it. You will have to be stepping back a lot because, again, this is one of those things where it's to the point, such a subtle change that up close you may not even see it. But again, that doesn't mean we shouldn't put it, and we need to put it.
Yeah, I'd never thought about, well, I was never really aware of core shadows until I was taught it in this program. And now it's such a kind of an empowering thing because there's some things looking flat and all of a sudden I'm remembering like, oh yeah, like I'm gonna throw that in there. Oh, where is it? Let me find it. If I can't see it, where would it be? And I know that from the anatomy studies that we've done.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely. Yeah. And that's a good point too that you're bringing up is it's looking flat. Oh, I need to find my core shadow. That's the kind of problem-solving process that we have to be going through. And we have to remember that it is almost 99.99% likely that we are not doing everything correct the first time, that we're not seeing everything to the fullest extent the first time. So, we rely on this process because it yields successful results, but we have to understand that the odds of being able to hit every little facet of this process correctly the first time is just so low. And so eventually, we're going to have to start to critically analyze our drawing and ask ourselves, why is it looking this way? Let me run through the list of everything I've learned, all my different shape measurements, all my different value relationship comparisons and edge comparisons, and then after that, what do I know about about shadow anatomy? What do I know about human anatomy?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's this big, long checklist of stuff that we have to go through. And eventually, if you go down the whole list, you'll be able to figure out what it is. But that is a long checklist, and especially if you haven't been conditioned, again, like we said, then it's a slower process, and it ends up being so slow. I think that students don't take advantage of it as much as they could or should. I know Richard Schmidt has this really great page spread in his book Alla Prima, which is basically a troubleshooting thing. He said, oh, is your painting looking strange? Go through the list, see what it is. And it's like, nice. 20 or 30 different things that could be wrong with the painting. And that's awesome. Great. That's exactly the sort of thing that we should be thinking of. And, that's a list that I would have on hand when I was painting so that I could go through that checklist. Or at very least go home and, pull out the book and then look at my painting and then run through that list. Mm-hmm. Because the more we can identify those common things that we're missing, the easier we'll be able to advance our skill set. We're getting pretty close to the end of this leg here. And again, I'm still working with the model at this stage here.
Did you choose to use the drapery just for compositional purposes?
Yeah, I wanted a little bit of flow to it to break up the figure a little bit. You know, also I think some of the shapes visually, and the negative spacing and the way the leg was flowing behind there was looking a little awkward, especially because the cushion was a little squishy. So she's physically quite a bit lower than it actually appears there, where the white chalk is indicating the chair she's sitting on. So there were just some oddities happening that made me want to include a drapery. And also, the other thing is that the original intent of this assignment, when the program began, was that we were going to have long enough in a pose like this that we would be able to have a model with a little bit of drapery in the pose, and maybe with some props or maybe in a setting, which is why I have started to build up the background and everything as well, too. What ultimately happened is we, in a 20-hour drawing, we just didn't end up having enough time for it. So for the most part, in a lot of these longer poses, the drapery's been removed. But every once in a while, we still throw it in there because it adds a nice little classical look in most cases. Now, I think in the reference photo, the drapery is not very flattering, and I don't end up rendering it like it looks in the reference photo. I went with a different combination of folds that I noted earlier, which is certainly something you can do because the drapery is never going to be the same each time. And you'll notice every once in a while the border between the drapery and the cap is adjusted, and that's because the drapery is changing a little bit. So here I've decided I'm going to fill in some of the dots on the torso. I need to match the smoothness of that arm on the right and the smoothness of the leg. So what I did with the stump was not to stump things down into the cracks. What I did with the stump was to lift off some of the top layer of chalk because I'm intending to go back in, as I'm doing now here, and fill in all these dots. So that stump work I just did was just to remove that top little coat. And now we're going in here, filling in all the dots, going to smooth it out. I'm not working with the model now. We have the picture-in-picture up just so you can sort of see how close it's getting when I fill in the dots. But ultimately, we're just filling in dots, and then I'll pull the model back, and then in maybe one or possibly two sittings, I'll fill in the rest of the subtle value shifts at that point. But this will allow me to get to that next level of sensitivity again.
There's no reason why you wouldn't be able to just take a scrap sheet of paper of maybe the paper you're planning on using for a longer sitting like this, because I mean, that's a pretty big commitment, 20 plus hours. And maybe you really like the tone of the paper, or you think you like the texture, and just sit down and, you know, mess around with your tools. And, you know, he had to say, like, I'm not stumping in, I'm lifting off, and you're not going to know what that feels like until you try to do that. So even if you just kind of mess around really for a little while on that sheet of paper and kind of practice different ways of using your stump and seeing what, you know, how sharp is sharp enough, you're going to know when you use the tools. And if you're really kind of nervous about, you know, waiting to troubleshoot on this, and you're going to be troubleshooting regardless, but maybe to prep yourself, make yourself feel a little bit more comfortable, just kind of mess around a little bit, no pressure. I would definitely suggest doing that.
Yeah, absolutely, ahead of time. I mean, you're going to be troubleshooting enough with the actual drawing itself to have to worry about materials.
That's a whole other thing.
And the level of sharpness of the pencil, interesting you brought that up, because I think I made a really deliberate effort here, you'll notice, to make my white chalk pencil sharper than it has been ever before in this drawing. Yeah, it is like to the max level of sharpness, because I'm looking at getting in here and filling in like specks within specks at this point. And you know, I'm actually kind of surprised you can't see my face here, because I really felt like my nose was against the wall when I was doing this. To get this level of sharpness in here. and fill in all these little dots. But to an extent, this works out well for me. I find some level of satisfaction
Yeah.
in filling in these dots. Maybe it's like a little obsessive compulsive thing for me,
Totally.
but something really satisfying about making something that looks really grainy look nice and smooth. It's so nice, and it feels also, I think, gratifying because at the end of it, for a little amount of mental effort, I got a maximum amount of finish look to here, and it's something. I don't even remember when I realized this. Maybe 2 years or so ago, maybe 3 years ago, I noticed that all of a sudden when I did this, it might have been with the Mona Lisa. When I did this, all of a sudden people looked at the drawing and they really stopped and were blown away by it. And that's when I started to understand that getting the right shape, value, and edge is good and is required, but this simple thing here is what's going to set it a notch above and have people be absolutely blown away by it. And it's funny to me just because this is something that I think almost anybody can do with a sharp enough pencil and enough time and patience. A lot of the other choices we make as far as measuring and shape, value, edge, those are challenging choices that require a high level of problem solving skills. This is just filling in dots. And the amount of payoff we get for it is just so high that I really enjoy that about this. And it allows me to, again, to think about all the other things of the drawing that I'm going to change. So it's a really good exercise for me to just be able to sort of mentally step back, assess, plan my next moves, and work out the rest of the drawing and still feel productive, still feel like I'm not wasting time. We talked about that before, that students might be afraid to spend too much time just sitting back and thinking about what to do next because they might feel like they're wasting time with the model. But this is something that you can do while thinking about the model and thinking about the drawing and not feel like you're wasting time and still get a lot out of it. Notice too, I'm bouncing all over, which is kind of nice. I don't have to be limited to one area. When it comes down to actually developing something out and rendering something out, I try to stick a little more into one area. But this is enjoyable just because I get to go wherever. Because you get bored. This is again 800 times faster or 800% faster than I'm actually working, so it's pretty slow. So I'll fill in as many dots as I can in one area. I'll think it's all filled, so I'll jump to another area. And as I'm filling in that other area, I'll notice spots in the previous areas that I might have missed. And so that jumping around really helps. And it's the same sort of jumping around that you should be doing mentally while you're working on the rest of your drawing. Not actually jumping around and working on the rest of your drawing, but still bouncing your eyes around and thinking about different parts of the drawing to make sure that what you're doing is appropriate and within the context of what you've established so far.
Right, and that's why you don't want to be watching a movie at the same time,
right,
and all that jazz.
Yeah.
What are the common mistakes at this point, or what's a mistake you've made in the past when you've been at this point in a drawing, this level of finish in this area, you're filling in dots? What's the biggest mistake you're going to make right now?
Well, the biggest potential mistake that could negatively affect the drawing, I would say, is just pressing too hard, like filling in the dots. But I mean, other than that, so much of this drawing is already sort of established, and as long as it was established correctly, then there's not much else that could go wrong. It's kind of nice to be at this stage because it's so clear at this point how it's going to develop, that there's not a whole lot of ambiguity. Whereas if we haven't developed the drawing up to this level before moving on, then we still have that ambiguity. And you kind of mentioned that how you like the idea of starting with the torso first and rendering that out. And one of the reasons that ends up being so nice is because you eliminate some of that ambiguity. You have something that's substantial and finished and a benchmarker for everything else. And if you like it, then the assumption is that if you continue along and make everything similar, then it'll work out.
Right.
Because remember, we're not looking at a master copy here. Like we have to make all the choices in how we're assigning shape and value and edge, and also how we're assigning the finish. And so it's it does seem like it's really up in the air, and that always made me anxious when I was painting, especially because everything I heard about from other professional artists was I have a clear idea of how the painting is going to be before I start. Almost every artist says that. And that scared me a lot because I had no idea. Not just because I hadn't done enough painting to have a preset style or whatever, but also because I never felt like I truly knew my skill set. And I didn't know what was within my capabilities, especially in an all prima setting. So knowing what I wanted to look like and how it would actually look could be two completely different things. And I think that produces a lot of anxiety in students here too, especially depending on our level of comfort, again, with all the process and measuring and everything. And we're working with a figure, some of us for the first time, for a long pose like this. And so we just don't know. It's how do I know when it's done? How do I know what it's supposed to look like? All this sort of uncertainty there. And the more uncertainty you have, the less likely you are to finish this strongly. Actually, the model's back here, so I am working from the model now for this last fine-tuning of the torso. So the solution to that then is pulling in, I think you mentioned before, like master copies to sit next to your easel, so you can use that as a benchmarker for level of finish, and that can keep you on the right path. At least until you establish, your torso, or your first shape that you're going to be comparing and relating everything else to. Other than that, anything can go wrong at this stage of the drawing. Anything that's not drawn yet, specifically, and I could still make an error on placement of plums or levels or comparisons or value assignments, and it could be something that I might not notice for a long time. Who knows? But it's just anything can happen. So whatever's not established right now, for example, I've got the lower leg I haven't rendered out, I have the head that I haven't lowered out. There's still a little bit of anxiety, and I think there probably always will be, that it's not going to come out exactly perfect. And it can all go wrong. But I just remind myself that if I remember to check all my plums and levels and angles and comparisons and sight size, and if I just relate the values back to the model already in the drawing I have, it will come out because, again, it's not any, it's standard results. It's like a mathematical equation. Now we can easily do math incorrectly and get the wrong answer.
Especially me.
Yeah. But we can at least have the comfort knowing that the equations will work given the right conditions.
Yeah, you're building your confidence working and kind of flushing out that first area.
Absolutely, yeah. And in any drawing or painting, for me especially, as soon as I get that first area figured out, it's like this huge sigh of relief, like, oh, okay, now I know what to do. And that's why the torso also took me a little longer, and I'll spend a little longer on the torso, because the better the torso looks, the more confident I get in the rest of the drawing. Now my traditional or normal older working method, which is more analogous to older schools, would be to do the head first and build the rest of the body on that. And so then my basis is on the head, like how well can I hit that head out? And for the most part, I consider myself to be a portrait artist also, and so my skill set to render a portrait is fairly high, so I can do that. But for a lot of us in the program at this point, with the head having so many subtle complexity, subtle complex shapes in it and changes in it, it might not be the best thing to start with, because then you could spend so long rendering or trying to figure that out that you don't have enough time for the rest of the figure, or you just might not yet have developed the sensitivity to be able to render that. So a lot of times in these 7-week drawings, especially for students who are just doing this long posting for the first time, we try to put the figure's face in a certain amount of shadow to simplify the issues with the head. But then in that same token, if the head is in shadow and really simplified, I wouldn't use that as my benchmarker to build confidence on. There's just not enough there to do that. So, the torso ends up being a good option. So that's really subtle now, laying in tiny little light veils, stepping back, seeing how it looks, using the stump as much as I can to lift off that top layer of chalk, as opposed to the click eraser, unless I absolutely can't get it off like there. I just couldn't get dark enough.
At what point are you using binoculars, and right now are you using them consistently, or?
Yeah, I'd be using them pretty consistently for any of these little tiny shapes in here. I was a lot for the hand, actually, for sure. And now I'm starting to get into them quite a bit. For some of the bigger changes on the torso, I wasn't, but for these, I'm getting into little tiny wrinkles and things now. Following the bottom end of the rib cage and some of the stomach muscles in here, and so I'm getting a little bit more precise. And actually, even though I'm using binoculars, I should mention too, I'm rarely using both eyes of the binoculars. I'm usually just looking through one. It's easier and quicker for me because then I don't have to focus.
Yeah.
And I actually had a monoscope for a while. I'm not sure what happened to it, but it was great. It was just like a spotting scope, one eye, and I had a lanyard. It was super light, so I just pop it up, look, and then go. And that's what I tend to rely on the most.
Yeah, I just got a monoscope myself.
Yeah. Tends to work really well. With drawing too, the color of the lens on whatever binocular or monoscope you get, it doesn't really matter too much. When we get to painting, you will have to be careful because you may end up needing to pick up a set that has no tinting, or at least has a good color quality to it. And I know David Casson uses a particular type of binoculars. I think that's intended for butterfly watching.
Okay.
And so the color in those are quite nice, good for painting especially. Because I've used some that have just have a little too much tinting, a little green tinting, a little orange tinting, something like that ends up not being really good for painting. For drawing though, it doesn't really matter too much as long as they're not too dark or too light.
Is it typical for you to kind of feel done with a certain area and then take a day and kind of rethink that and reevaluate, like, I would rather push that, or I mean, it's typical to see, I guess to see maybe what doesn't match, what you thought matched, or whatever.
Yeah, that's typical. Anytime you take a longer break and come back, you can definitely see that. When we're working with a limited time frame with a model like this, it ends up being a little different because you have to let some things go, and we have to run it through that filtration in our heads of, is it believable enough, is it not believable enough, and if it's different but believable, I'm leaving it anyway, kind of thing. And so then you leave things that you might have otherwise changed, or conversely, we might just leave things because it's good enough and we don't feel like chasing them, So it depends on, for me, on how much time I have with the model, first and foremost. If I have a model for painting that I know is going on vacation or something for like a month, and I have a set deadline for for when I need to get this painting finished before she leaves, then it certainly becomes is this good enough to be believable? If it is, move forward. And then if I have more time with the model, I can get really nitpicky. But usually I know that before I start the drawing or painting, so I kind of have an idea of how I'm going to be noodling or how directly I'm going to be working on this piece. And so that gives me kind of a benchmarker. And typically that becomes directly translates into the rendering level that happens. It should never translate into the correctness, really, because if it's wrong, I'll revisit it. So that's kind of a completely different issue, and that might be a more apt question for students: is if you come back and notice it's wrong, do you go back and fix it? That answer is yes, always 100% yes. You just don't even move on unless it's right. But as far as how it's developing aesthetically with the amount of level of rendering in there, I usually have a pretty fair idea at this point, based off of how much time I know I'm going to have on this drawing. And so I can at least be mentally prepared and not be stressed over the fact that I wanted to do a really flushed out rendering, but it's going to be a direct painting instead, kind of a thing. I kind of accept that before starting.
So I'm noticing that you're using your charcoal over areas that I think you had some white chalk as well. Am I correct in seeing that, or?
There might be a
Little
few
bit.
areas, very small amounts. And if I'm doing that, it's really with the intent that it's going to be the last pass. And sometimes you're seeing it where, for example, the white chalk or whatever might be so embedded already that it's not coming off, and therefore it's not really going to mix too much with the charcoal if I'm light enough with the charcoal and lay it right on top. And that's the key there too, because there are going to be areas where they have to interlock to some degree. Otherwise, you do end up with that really strange, rigid boundary between the white chalk and the charcoal. And so it's going to come down to overlapping the chalk and charcoal lightly enough so that they're not mixing, which will be directly similar to how we end up painting, because we're going to have to lay lighter strokes on top of darker strokes, and we can't have them mix. If they mix, then we get mud. Same is true here, so it really comes down to a pressure amount. So yeah, here I'm going over a little bit of the white, and it's just so light that it's laying right on top. You're not getting that sort of bluish, weird haze that you might typically see. And that bluish, kind of gross haze is why I discourage students from mixing the two, for sure. But once we're getting into this final level of rendering, there has to be an overlapping, and there has to be an interlocking to some degree. And I'm getting to the point where in some of these areas, lifting out with the stump or the click eraser is just not becoming effective enough, because I'm getting into now to such a subtle level now where that tiny little tap of lifting off with the stump is not subtle enough. I talked about before, we've got this whole drawing of how great and subtle it was, but now we're to the level where the interlocking and the transitions of values are just so fine that that's not working out anymore either. And it's at this point, it's just tiny little applications of the charcoal. So I'm pretty much, for the most part, done with this torso. And what I'm actually working on right now is just figuring out its transitions into the background a little bit, where there are going to be some lost edges, where the edge is going to be harder, where are they going to be softer. So I'm trying to figure that all out right now, knock some of them down. I don't want it to look like I cut her out and pasted her on a white background. And so that's something, we talked about with the portrait drawing is where are we going to alter the edge quality throughout. On the arm on the right, you can kind of see how that edge quality and even the angles are changing all the way up that arm. It's not one consistent angle or one consistent edge quality. And so here I was trying to do the same thing with the torso. And now we've got to throw this leg in here. Now with the leg here, I don't have a whole lot of white chalk in this area. And I've kind of gone back and forth about what I think, if I think the light area might be white chalk. And eventually I decided here, no, it's not going to be. And then I think later on I decided it's just going to be a little bit of it. And it's just because it's dancing that line of the right about the tone of the paper. And so I'm still kind of working that out. But since the darks here are easier for me to see, the more logical solution is to start with the darks. And then from there, I'll use that to understand the lights.
I think I've confused, to go back quick to edge quality, I think I've confused, and my brain is still kind of sorting out the relationship between, if there is any, which I think there is, between value and edge. And I think when I think of edge and when I think of harder edges, I'm immediately thinking darker. And I don't know, have you seen that before? Is this like,
yeah.
Am I?
Yeah, no, and I think part of that is because when there's a harder edge, we typically use that pencil to crisp up the edge, and it makes it a little darker sometimes. And so we kind of start to associate, when it's a harder edge, it might be darker. The other thing, too, is the harder the edge, the more contrast there typically is between two shapes. And so we start to associate that. And edge and value are definitely interlocked in that way, for sure. And to be more precise, it's, edge quality is determined by the quickness or slowness with which that transition or that contrast takes place. So a high contrast of two shapes, but over a stretched out area, produces a softer edge. So we can go from black to white, over the course of a few inches, it looks pretty soft. But if we go black to white immediately without any gap in between, it's a very, very hard edge. And so then it's the range between the two of that determines the edge quality. And a lot of students, I think, don't even tend to consider it this way, don't even realize that value transition is what's creating the edge quality. Especially when we get into painting. We think of edge quality as just, you take your brush and soften it or leave it hard, which is true to a degree, because really what you're doing when you soften that brush is you're creating a transition between two values, or in the case of painting, two colors. But it's a good idea to understand that even without a brush or even without a stump, we can command any edge quality with the application of values. And that's kind of something that we started in the very beginning in term one, is, I wanted everybody after that initial stump to be using veils with pencils, and as you match the values correctly and the quickness or slowness with which those values happen, the edge quality tends to take care of itself. The problem will become in, for example, a situation like this, where maybe my value of the leg is not matching the value of, the value of the leg and the paper around it is not necessarily matching the reference value of the leg and the paper, or the background around it. So for example, the background color in the reference photo is lots of different values all the way around the leg. On my paper, it's one value. So as a result, that's going to alter my perception of the edge quality in the reference photo. For example, it's more of a lost edge on the top side of that lower leg, where the mid value or so of the leg melts into that sort of cast shadow on the wall back there. It becomes kind of a lost edge, especially if we were to see that in black and white. Whereas the foot is a lighter value with the cast shadow, so it looks like a harder edge. And just like the calf is dark against the wall back there, it looks like a harder edge. So now I'm trying to translate edge quality here without having that advantage of using the value to create that edge quality. And that's something that we kind of saw just before with the arm and how that arm varied in edge quality all the way going up. And it's something that you can, where you're trying to artificially create an edge quality without utilizing the value range. And that requires just a really sensitive level of tiny little adjustments, either with the stump or with a veil, where you kind of just break up an edge if it's intended to be lost just a little bit, or go through with your HB and crisp it up if it's intended to be a little bit sharper. Not necessarily changing the values, not necessarily saying it's a sharp edge, I need to make it darker, but crisping it up. The darkness, in this case with the calf, is what's helping it read as a hard edge. But we're going to utilize an HB pencil and crisp it up to create that edge quality instead. And this is why, if you have sharp pencils too, and especially more textured paper, if your pencils are dull on a textured paper, you can't get hard edges. It's not possible because the texture of the paper is diffusing the mark. So as the mark gets diffused and it gets sort of that gravelly look to it, then you're just creating a transition from the mark you made to the paper, and that transition translates into a soft edge. Whereas the harder the pencil you make, the crisper the line you make, the more rapid that value transition and the harder the edge. So without sharp pencils, you therefore sacrifice your ability to make a variety of edges. And again, the most common issue with edges that I see in the classroom in an open studio is that in general, they're all too soft. They're in that the soft to firm range. You're missing all the hard edges and all the sharp edges. And I think largely it's because of pencils. Students just don't have pencils that are sharp enough, and they're not using them to create those rapid transitions of values enough. So notice I'm just using a lot of veils now in different directions after that initial stump, both with the pencil and with the eraser to coax the lights into the and darks into the right area. What you can't see in the reference photo, I think, is, actually, I think it was a different, slightly different view. In the reference photo, her foot is down so much that the cushion is kind of blocking some of the lower part of the foot. While I'm drawing it here, I can actually see a little bit below